with Greg Epping today. Greg has a long track record of leadership positions within some of the largest life sciences companies in the market. But the reason that we're here today is his recent experience of being able to really improve the representation of women within leadership positions in the teams that sit underneath him. So thanks so much for taking the time to speak today, Greg. As a starting point, it would be great if you could just expand on what I've just said and give us all a bit of an introduction to you.
Emily, thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here today. I appreciate the invite. So I've been about 30 years in the laboratory space, I'll call it more generally. The second half of my career, mostly in the selling side of capital into life science organizations. Held my first management role back when was in my mid-20s. And I've had about the last 12 years or so, I've been in senior leadership roles at some large global life science companies. The reason we're here today is my most recent role that got our conversation going, right? I was talking about how I was able to pretty dramatically change the landscape, the leadership landscape on my management team. When I hired into that role, we had 0 women in leadership roles. When I exited it, we had 9, which was about half of the leaders were female. And so that got our whole conversation going. Greg, how'd you do that, right? And so I'll say this, right? Anybody can do it. It's really a couple things that we'll get into more depth, of course, as we go through the various questions here. But the things I wanted to point out before we get started is, I never had a specific agenda to dramatically change the landscape and promote women. And the second thing is that every time I created or promoted somebody into a role, it was the most qualified person for the role at that time. I simply followed a robust talent planning process without bias that very naturally led to this endpoint. And that's kind of what I want to share with you today.
Great. And as you say, we can delve into some of those points later on in the conversation. But as a starting point, I wanted to hear from you. How is it that you define diversity?
Yeah, so diversity is really about inclusion of all associates from all backgrounds in an environment where all feel valued and safe to share their opinions and their ideas. And so you'll note that I started the definition of diversity with the word inclusion. It really starts with inclusion, right? I mean, diversity and inclusion work together very symbiotically, but unless you have a truly inclusive culture, it's going to be really hard to identify, to I think, build a culture where women feel welcomed to apply for leadership roles and know that they'll be treated equitably going through the process.
Okay. So as you say there, perhaps considering those two things as separate entities is a bit of a barrier really to achieving either type of culture, inclusive, diverse, both together. What would you say some of the other kind of challenges to gender or equal gender representation within the life sciences market in leadership in particular?
Yeah, I think overwhelmingly, I'm going to use the term unconscious bias, right? And I know for me, it was definitely a situation of self-awareness and me fully exploring unconscious bias, which is a difficult thing for people to do. So I've done a lot of coaching around this with other leaders. And, I found the most easy way of approaching somebody with the subject is, if you try to ask somebody, well, what are you biased against, right? You get on defense and, it's not something that you want to think about, right? It's hard to do. So instead, right, you kind of lead a conversation where you start exploring, well, what am I biased towards, right? And we're human, so we tend to appreciate people that are like ourselves, right? That's kind of who we want to spend time with and we're most comfortable with. So we have a bias towards something, right? And as soon as somebody starts acknowledging that they have a bias towards something, and we all do, that should automatically trigger a mechanism in your brain where you say, well, if I'm biased towards something, that probably means I'm not giving this other group the proper amount of attention. right? I'm not comfortable working with them or whatever else. So one is a byproduct of the other. And that's really what unconscious bias is that, we tend to hire people like ourselves. We have to explore this. And it's a really important topic for this, because when you go into a talent planning process, I think you need to approach it very self-aware and of your unconscious biases. So you include people in your roadmap, right, that are not like you, because you build a better, stronger, diverse organization when you do that. So that's the major take of it. The other things that I'll note, when you have a culture where there's not women in leadership roles, it self-propagates, right? It's a vicious cycle. No one wants to be first. It's hard to do if you're going to be the first woman in leadership roles. And so because there's a lack of women, other women don't feel welcome and encouraged to apply for those roles. And then even, when you do find a woman and you invest and you promote somebody to the role, what I've experienced is very often they go through this thing called imposter syndrome, right? I didn't deserve this role, right? I was promoted because I was a woman, or whatever it might be. And all these internal voices go to work on them, and they work super hard. They're sometimes your highest achievers, right? Because they're working crazy hours and everything. And you're like, wow, she's incredible. Meanwhile, there's these terrible voices going on inside of doubt. And I think that, after you promote somebody into a role, woman in particular, you need to make some additional investment and have these conversations to make sure you set them up for success. And that might involve getting them a professional coach to work on the side with them, or other supporting services as well. But I wasn't even aware of it. And a coach we got for a new leader that I had promoted came to me and educated me on this topic. And it's been very eye-opening. So I encourage people to look up that topic as well and explore it further. Absolutely.
And you touch on a couple of things there. And I know that we come back to this term, talent mapping, and how that can overcome it. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have the time to be able to do that justice here today, but I know that you've been able to work on a bit of a white paper surrounding that, and people can kind of come to that after this has gone out. So that I just wanted to mention that, because I think there's some really useful points of how to go about that. You mentioned various challenges there: imposter syndrome, the unconscious bias, of course, and also how the lack of representation can lead to further lack of representation. What did you do to overcome these challenges?
Yeah, so I think going in more depth, I've leaned heavily on identifying talent early and investing in their development, so that when we had a role open in leadership, we had somebody that was a very natural fit that already been groomed for the role. Right. It was without question the right person for the role at the time. Now, supporting that, of course, I've always said there's been a formal talent planning processes around. I've had some excellent HR business partners, just been blessed with wonderful people. I wish I could say their names out loud, because they've been just instrumental in helping me through these processes. And I'll just point out that, most life science companies already have a formal talent planning process in place. But a lot of leaders just go through a check the box exercise, right, of filling it and getting it done on time. I mean, you have to come into that process, first of all, right, exploring your bias, so that you make sure you put the right people in scope. And the second thing is, right, you have to take it seriously. And I know you're rushed and you're busy, and it can become a check the box exercise. And maybe you do have to check the box just to meet a deadline. But then be very genuine and true to the process and come back to it. And make sure you're scheduling those regular, touch points with the talent in your organization, skip level conversations, whatever it might take, so that you are moving the organization forward with regard to developing the best talent.
Absolutely. And to sum everything up then, taking this maybe away from you in particular, if we look at the broader picture, what advice would you give to current or future leaders who want to follow in your footsteps?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is, step one is acknowledge that a problem exists. That's always step one. But honestly, right, even if you have a matrix where it looks diverse, are you inclusive? Right? Honestly, ask the right questions and do it. And realize there's a cycle. right? And that cycle might be self-propagating because of unconscious bias that you and other leaders have in the organization. And that's really where the leader sets the tone. Start with yourself, fully explore your unconscious bias, and make sure that you are entering into these situations eyes wide open when you do your talent planning. Follow the formal talent planning process, right? Do it very genuine and true to the process. Do it with care for others in the organization, right? Hold one-on-ones, skip levels. I said that earlier, but also hold open forums, right? With people where, and not just one, right? I mean, these are uncomfortable when you first start doing them because you're talking about some topics that haven't been talked about before. But when you do them repeatedly, you'll see that the robustness of the conversations increases dramatically, the honesty and the open sharing. And by doing that, you're actually changing your culture in your organization. So those are really important things to do. Hold yourself accountable. When you have an open role and you lack a diverse slate of candidates to fill it, or you had to go outside your organization, right, to fill it, really hold yourselves accountable and say, why? Why wasn't I ready to fill this role? And then look at the process and say, what are we going to do different next time so that when a role does come open, someone is ready? Because here I had this very talented individual that we should have been developing for the last 18 months, and somehow it didn't happen. But she would be a natural fit for this role if she had these right experiences, right, along her journey. And if you're the hiring manager, this is just, I'm gonna throw this as anecdotally, it's kind of a pet peeve of mine. When you have a candidate that didn't get the role, take the time to give them some very candid feedback that they can use to develop themselves, right? Don't do the, and you're gonna get embarrassed, but I've done it, right? Sorry, there were just other more qualified candidates. So it wasn't a good cultural fit, right? We're going a different direction, the generic stuff. Avoid that, right? Really give something that's concise so the person can take it back and do something with it and develop in these weak areas. So next time you have an opening, they're the obvious fit for the role because they've worked on these things, right? So please hold yourselves accountable with that as well. Some advice to the individual that's aspiring to go in a leadership role. What really, really helps is if you find somebody that's in leadership role at your organization that's willing to personally invest in you and your career. Very, very important, right? If it's not your immediate manager or somebody in your own vertical, look outside of that and expand your scope. You will not only expand your reach into other areas of the company, which increases your visibility, you might go on somebody else's talent planning instead of people that are just in your own vertical and organization as well. So those are some things that I've seen work, right, at different places that I've been.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Greg. And I think there's two things that really stand out for me there. First of all, as you say, we've all done it. We've all given the kind of textbook feedback. It's not a cultural fit. It's not, oh, they just went in a different direction, and it's not helpful. And there's an area that I can hold myself accountable. Perhaps you can hold yourself accountable. We all can together. To make improvements here. And really, that's my main takeaway from this conversation. I know you've spoken about these cycles and how these cycles can self-propagate, and ultimately how that's led us to where we are today with this issue with inequality in the representation of women within life sciences leadership. And that's what this whole series is about, really. So it's really helpful that you've given some ideas as to how we can break those cycles. And it's the idea that perhaps actually the positive could self-propagate. Once you've broken one cycle, the next can be broken, and so on. So that's been really helpful and really valuable for me to listen, and hopefully for everyone else too.
No, thank you. It reminds me of a little bit more I'll share if you don't mind. So I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, we went from 0 to 9 women leaders in my organization. I'll point out that maybe half of those women were actually promoted by me directly. By me promoting diverse leaders, they also promoted other women, right? So it shows that you can break the cycle and create a very sustainable self-propagating model as well when that works. Now, I don't think the journey's done, right? I'm certainly not done molding and improving me, and I think every organization always has work to do. But I think these are the right conversations to be having, and this is the right time to be having them.
Absolutely. No, thanks for that, Greg. And thanks again for your time today.